Ashtray. That's what they'd been calling her for 3 weeks, the nickname spreading through Oak Creek Memorial's night shift like an infection nobody bothered treating. Ashtray. Cute. Original. She didn't flinch when she heard it, didn't correct anyone, didn't ask them to stop. They didn't know. They had no idea that the quiet nurse pushing the med cart at 2 in the morning had spent 847 nights in places where nicknames meant something, where call signs earned in blood and dust stayed with you for the rest of your life. The faded unit patch still hanging in her locker, sewn inside the lining of a jacket she hadn't worn since 2009, told a story nobody here was equipped to understand. What happened next would remind her exactly why she'd chosen to disappear into anonymity, why she'd buried that version of herself under 12 years of civilian work and borrowed normalcy. Ashley Cooper moved through the fluorescent corridors of Oak Creek Memorial at 0200 hours with the quiet efficiency of someone who had done this 10,000 times before, though her 10,000 times looked different than anyone else's. While the day shift nurses moved with the harried energy of people trying to save the world before their shift ended, Ashley moved like someone conserving resources, tracking exits, noting personnel positions the way a tactical officer reads a room. The antiseptic smell, that particular blend of bleach and rubbing alcohol and something indefinably chemical that only emergency rooms seemed to produce, didn't bother her anymore. Neither did the fluorescent lights that hummed overhead like insects trapped in glass, or the intermittent beeping of monitors from rooms she'd already passed. She'd learned to filter sensory input down to what mattered: vital signs, medication times, patient trajectories, threat assessments. The limp in her left leg was barely noticeable now, just a slight hesitation in her step that most people attributed to tired feet after a long shift rather than to shrapnel that still sat embedded against her alpha vertebra, close enough to her spinal cord that surgery would be too risky. Pain was information. That's what they'd taught her at Walter Reed. 2 years of learning to walk again, learning to sleep without waking up swinging, learning to sit in a room with civilians without scanning for exits. The Walter Reed part she'd managed. The civilian part was proving harder. She passed the nurse's station where the monitors displayed a synchronized symphony of vital signs: BP, heart rate, oxygen saturation, respiratory rate. Beep. 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 The rhythm of the ER, constant and mechanical. Dr. Marcus Caldwell sat at the central desk reviewing patient files on his tablet, his shoulders angled with the territorial intensity of a man who believed he owned every breathing thing within a 1,000-foot radius. His jaw had a particular set to it, clenched at the back, visible tension working through his masseter muscle, that suggested he'd been awake too long on too much coffee and had started making decisions from a place of exhaustion and ego rather than competence. She'd seen that look on commanders before. It never ended well. She passed his line of sight without meeting his eyes, her badge clipped to her scrubs at the correct angle, her name written in careful block letters: A. Cooper, RN. The first initial had been a choice. Easier to be A. Cooper than Ashley. Easier to be a surname than a history. By 0230 hours, the admission flow had slowed to a trickle. A homeless man with pneumonia in bed 4, a diabetic with a hypo spike in bed 7, a motor vehicle accident victim being prepped for transfer to the trauma center in bed 12. Routine. Manageable. The kind of shift where she could exist in the margins, do the work, collect her paycheck, and leave without having drawn any more attention than necessary. But attention was being drawn. She could feel it the way she'd learned to feel things at FOB Shank, Loga Province, 2007, a certain pressure in the air that meant someone was watching. Someone was calculating. At 0245, the mass casualty drill began. It came through the radio, crackling through the overhead speaker like every other announcement: attention, mass casualty drill. Mass casualty drill. All personnel to stations. The overhead lights didn't change color like they would during an actual emergency, but the energy in the ER shifted anyway, that electrical current of preparation that turned routine into performance. Ashley moved to her station in Trauma Bay 3 without hesitation, pushing the crash cart into position with practiced precision. A training dummy lay on the gurney, a full-size mannequin with synthetic skin and articulated limbs, the kind that bled simulated blood when you cut it and beeped when you got the vital signs right. Expensive. Realistic enough for most purposes. Not realistic enough for anyone who'd actually held a person together while their body was coming apart, but the simulation wasn't designed for people like that. The scenario was simple: sucking chest wound. A penetrating trauma to the left anterior chest wall, air entering the pleural space with each breath, causing the lung to collapse. The trainers watched from the observation window above the trauma bay, clipboards ready, marking efficiency scores. Most of the trauma team went through the motions they'd practiced 100 times: expose the wound, assess for active bleeding, begin fluid resuscitation. Textbook responses. Correct responses. The kind of responses that worked when you had unlimited time and unlimited resources and nobody was actually dying. Ashley moved to the supply cart and pulled out an MRE packet, meals ready to eat, standard field rations from her deployment bags that she still kept in her locker despite 12 years of civilian work and despite the fact that no hospital in the continental United States stocked them. The plastic was thick, the kind of plastic that held up under pressure changes and temperature fluctuations. She tore it open with one motion, a practiced gesture, muscle memory, and cut a section approximately 4 inches by 6 inches with the trauma shears she kept clipped to her waistband. 18 seconds, start to finish. The synthetic blood on the mannequin's chest had created the perfect seal point, air hissing out around the wound edges. She placed the plastic, pressed it down with her palms, and held it steady while the pressure differential sealed it against the skin. The hissing stopped. The simulated oxygen saturation on the monitor, which had been plummeting toward dangerous levels, stabilized and began climbing. 78%. 82%. 86%. Trending upward now, the way it should. The room went so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights hum overhead, that high-pitched whine they made when everything else fell away. That's when Dr. Caldwell's voice came through the intercom from the observation window above: "Pause drill. Pause the drill." The other nurses stopped moving, standing in place like actors hit with a sudden lighting cue. Caldwell appeared moments later, his shoes audible on the tile before he entered the bay, a click, 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 the sound of someone announcing his arrival rather than slipping quietly through. His eyes moved to the improvised seal Ashley had created, lingering on the MRE packaging now taped to the mannequin's synthetic skin with actual medical tape. "Where did you learn that technique?" His voice was measured, conversational, the way a man spoke when he was pretending he didn't already know the answer and was just testing to see how good a liar you were. Ashley kept her hand steady on the seal, didn't look away from her work. Her voice came out low and even, the way she'd learned to sound when she didn't want to be noticed. "County General ran military preparedness training after the 9th of November, Doctor. Thought it was useful." The lie was smooth, rehearsed. She'd told it before. She'd tell it again if she needed to. County hospitals did run that training. It was just that she'd learned this particular technique in 2005 in Sangin Valley, Helmand Province, when an IED had taken out her transport and she'd had to keep a junior Marine alive through a collapsed lung and a 17-mile extraction that took 42 hours, most of it on foot through terrain that wanted nothing more than to finish the job the explosive had started. But Caldwell didn't need to know that. Nobody needed to know that. His eyes tracked from the seal to her hands, hands that didn't tremble, didn't shake, didn't show any of the nervous response you'd expect from someone telling a story under pressure, and then to her face. He was looking for tells. Most people were transparent enough that you could read their vital signs by watching their face. But Ashley had learned to be opaque. Her heart rate had stayed steady. Her breathing pattern hadn't shifted. Her pupils hadn't dilated. She was a closed system, everything running at baseline, nothing leaking out. "County General," Caldwell repeated, and it wasn't a question anymore, it was an accusation wearing a question's clothing. "That's the facility listed in your employment history, correct?" "Yes, Doctor." 3 words. Maximum simplicity. Minimum information. 12 years with them. And 8 months, she added, because specificity sounded more true than round numbers. People lied with round numbers. "Before here." He nodded, still watching her hands. The seal was holding perfectly, textbook application, the kind of thing you'd see demonstrated in a special operations medical course, not a civilian nurse's shift at a Norfolk hospital. He turned to the other trauma nurses, still standing in position around the bay. The rest of you, excellent work today. Standard protocols, excellent execution. Then back to her, we're done with the drill. You can remove the seal and begin cleanup. It wasn't the dismissal. The dismissal came after he left, which he did, his footsteps clicking back through the hallway with the same announcing cadence. The other nurses looked at each other. One of them, Janet, been at Oak Creek for 6 years, made a face like she'd bitten into something bitter. Where did you actually learn that? The question was curious, not aggressive, but curiosity was a door Ashley had learned to keep locked. Training course, she said, pulling the tape off the mannequin's synthetic skin. Long time ago. She disposed of the MRE packaging in the biohazard bin and moved the crash cart back into its charging position. End of conversation. End of drill. End of the evening, which was fine by her. She preferred nights. Fewer administrative people around. Fewer questions. Fewer eyes tracking her movements. The night shift was her kingdom, and kingdoms work best when the queen stayed invisible. But she could still feel Dr. Caldwell's attention somewhere in the building, that weight of observation that meant someone had seen something they weren't supposed to see and was starting to ask questions that wouldn't be answered with rehearsed lines about county hospital training. At 0315, she took her break and moved to the staff break room, which was empty except for the humming refrigerator and the fluorescent lights that somehow managed to make everything look like it was underwater. She sat at the plastic table, red and scratched, the kind of furniture designed to be invisible and interchangeable, and opened her phone to the single photo she kept saved in a private album. A unit patch. Faded green and gold thread on desert tan cloth. Task Force dagger. Her name embroidered across the bottom in letters so small you could barely read them unless you knew what you were looking for. She'd cut it from her uniform jacket the day she made the decision to stop being Major Ashley Cooper, Special Forces, and start being A. Cooper, RN, just another anonymous nurse trying to build a life where nobody asked questions about where the scars came from or why her hands didn't shake when they should. The patch had been sewn into the lining of her civilian jacket for 12 years, carried like a secret, like a lifeline, like the last piece of evidence that she had been someone other than this. She put the phone away. At 0330, she heard it, the radio from the ER bay, the alert tone that meant incoming trauma. Not a drill. The real thing. Her break ended. She moved back into the corridor, her limp almost imperceptible now, her face blank, her hands already preparing for whatever was coming through those doors. At 0347, she was standing in Trauma Bay 3 when they wheeled in a John Doe, late 20s or early 30s, severe lacerations on his left arm, possible internal bleeding. The attending physician swarmed him immediately, shouting orders, cutting away clothing to assess damage. Ashley moved to his right side, checking vitals, taking notes, hands moving through the practice sequence of crisis triage. That's when she saw it. High on his left pectoral, wrapped around his shoulder, a trident tattoo. Navy SEAL insignia. And below it, just barely visible as one of the trauma surgeons repositioned him, the faded edge of a unit patch. Task Force dagger. The specific marking of someone who'd served in Sangin, 2005. The color drained from her face, just for a moment, just a microsecond, but she recovered it immediately, pulled her composure back down over her features like armor. She'd learned how to do that at Walter Reed. She'd learned how to look like nothing was happening when everything was happening. But her hands knew better. Her hands remembered. And one moment, just one, they wanted to shake. The overhead paging system crackled at 1,247 hours during shift change, the waiting room packed with families, patients in wheelchairs, a child crying in the corner while her mother filled out intake forms. The voice was clinical, institutional, designed to carry across the entire emergency department. Ashtray to administration. Ashtray to administration, immediately. 30 heads turned. A patient's family member smirked. A grandmother blinked, confused. Veteran nurse Sharon winced so hard her shoulders tensed. Ashley stood at the nurse's station, charting a patient's post-operative vitals, her pen continuing its steady movement across the paper for exactly 2 more seconds before she set it down with deliberate care. One measured breath. Her face revealed nothing, the kind of calm that comes from having already survived worse than a derogatory nickname echoing through an emergency room. She stood, smoothed her scrubs, and walked toward the administrative wing while whispers followed her like shrapnel, bouncing off tile and fluorescent lights. Behind her, Sharon muttered something about reporting that to HR. Ashley didn't turn around. The supply closet was accessed from the medication storage area, a narrow space lined with boxes of gauze, saline bags, wound dressings stacked 3 high. Caldwell was waiting inside when she arrived at 1,500 hours. He pulled the door closed behind her and stepped forward until his face was inches from hers, coffee-sour breath and the sharp scent of his cologne, something expensive and aggressive, filling the confined space. His presence made the air pressure change, as if the oxygen itself was being compressed. "I've been reviewing pharmaceutical logs," he hisses, his finger jabbing toward her sternum without quite touching. "Discrepancies. Big ones. Fentanyl patches. Midazolam vials. Propofol syringes. And your name keeps appearing on the access records for the times medications went missing." Ashley's back pressed against shelving, boxes of MRE packaging behind her, the same kind she'd once used to create a chest seal in a building with no roof and children screaming in Dari. Her voice stayed level despite the confined space, despite the rage building behind her ribs like pressure before an explosion. "I documented every withdrawal with physician orders and I don't care what you documented," Caldwell interrupts, his voice low enough that no one in the hallway would hear. "You discuss this with anyone? The state board? Administration? Other staff? Anyone? And you're terminated for theft. We're talking about your license, Cooper. Your career. Am I clear?" A single tear escapes her left eye, not from fear but from the sheer accumulated weight of 3 weeks of this man's campaign against her, 3 weeks of isolation and reassignment and whispers. She wipes it without breaking eye contact, her hand steady as a surgical laser, and when she speaks, her voice sounds like cut glass. "I've been threatened by men who were actually dangerous, Doctor." Caldwell's face reddens. He steps back. The supply closet suddenly feels larger. He reaches for the door handle, then turns. "Night shift. Permanent. Effective immediately. You'll work 1900 to 0700, restricted to the waiting room triage until I decide otherwise." He leaves before she can respond. The door swings shut with a soft hiss of air escaping. The parking lot demotion occurs during the evening shift huddle, 18:30 hours, 15 staff members gathered around the assignment board in the break room. Caldwell walks in with a clipboard, his movements precise and deliberate, the kind of calculated performance that suggests he's practiced this moment. "Listen up. Staffing changes effective tonight." He pauses, making eye contact around the room before his gaze settles on Ashley. "Cooper, you're being moved to permanent nights, effective immediately. Your attitude problems and inability to follow chain of command make you unsuitable for day shift responsibilities." Ashley stands absolutely still as her colleagues look anywhere but at her face, down at their coffee cups, out the window at the grey Norfolk afternoon, at the assignment board as if the posted rotations suddenly demand their complete attention. Sharon starts to object, her voice sharp with objection. "Dr. Caldwell, that's not fair, she's our best," but Caldwell silences her with a look, the kind of look that reminds everyone he's the director. The kind of look that ends careers if it needs to. Ashley picks up her reassignment paperwork with hands that don't tremble, nods once to acknowledge the order, and walks to the locker room. Behind her, Caldwell begins verbally reassigning her patients to nurses he controls, his voice carrying down the hallway like a threat. She doesn't break stride. Doesn't look back. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. The trauma alert arrives at Oak Creek Memorial at 03 for 7 hours on Saturday, Coast Guard helicopter rotors shaking the windows of the East Wing, the radio crackle urgent and precise. Elizabeth River recovery, male, hypothermic, found unconscious, possible training accident, ETA for minutes. Ashley is working the overnight, newly permanent nights, as Caldwell made abundantly clear when the call comes through. She moves to Trauma Bay 3 with the automatic efficiency of someone who has done this 400 times before, setting up the warming blankets, the kit, the portable defibrillator, her hands moving through the choreography without conscious thought. The rotor wash shook the windows. The trauma team assembled. When the patient comes through the doors on the stretcher, his body is pale, shaking with involuntary muscle contractions, seawater dripping from his dark hair. Ashley cuts away the wetsuit with trauma shears, her movements efficient and impersonal, revealing a body that tells a story she recognizes, not from her current life, but from another one. Bullet wounds. Shrapnel scars. Surgical marks from field extraction. And on his shoulder, a trident tattoo, the insignia of SEAL Team 3, rendered in faded ink that had been applied approximately 23 years ago, when he was still young enough to believe tattoos meant something permanent. When she bags his personal effects, her hands pause for half a second, not long enough for anyone to notice, but long enough for her mind to catalogue everything. She glimpses the insignia on his gear, SEAL Team 3. Charlie Platoon from the faded marking on his combat jacket. She knows this patch. She's seen this exact patch before. Her mind accelerates through time zones and years and the face of a 4-year-old boy with terrified eyes. Then she's back in the trauma bay, establishing for access with a 20-gauge angiocath, monitors showing vitals, core temp 34.2, heart rate 142, blood pressure stable at 118/79, but the shaking suggests peripheral shutdown. She documents everything with mechanical precision: time, vitals, medication administration, a field note that reads male DOA, deceased on arrival, revived by Coast Guard. Unknown identity. SEAL insignia suggests active duty or retired. But when she's packing his gear into the evidence bag, she sees it, a photograph, water-damaged but preserved in a protective plastic, showing a dark-haired woman in Special Forces uniform holding a small boy. The woman's face is younger, unscarred, but the eyes are identical to the ones Ashley sees in the mirror every morning. She palms the photograph. The unit patch follows, faded fabric that smells like salt water and diesel fuel, and memories she spent 12 years trying to bury. Dr. Caldwell appears in the doorway at 0:21 hours, reviewing the patient's gear with unusual interest, his movements too deliberate, too focused. Ashley watches him photograph the SEAL insignia with his phone, watches him make a hushed call in the hallway. She catches fragments: yes, he's here, no identification yet, I can move him to the secure wing. Her hands continue their work with no change in pace, but her mind accelerates. What happened next changed everything. When Caldwell returns, his voice is smooth as silk. "Cooper, I need you in the waiting room." Triage. Senior staff on this case. It isn't a request. It's a command. Ashley submits without argument because she's learned that compliance buys time. She nods, steps back, and as she leaves the trauma bay, she palms the patient's gear bag and tucks it into a supply closet on the 3rd floor, behind boxes of sterile gauze and saline solution, including the photograph of the woman and the boy. Her hands remembered everything they were taught to do. And for just a moment, standing in the darkness of that supply closet, they wanted to shake. But they didn't. She has for hours before Caldwell notices the missing items. For hours to figure out what comes next. The clock is already running. The Coast Guard radio chatter crackled through Oak Creek Memorial's trauma alert system at 03 for 7 hours Saturday morning. Male, mid-30s, pulled from the Elizabeth River, hypothermic and unresponsive, ETA for minutes. Ashley was already moving before the overhead page finished, muscle memory bridging the gap between civilian nurse and something else entirely. The trauma bay doors hissed open and she was there, gloved, masked, ready, watching the stretcher roll through like she'd been waiting for this exact moment her entire career. The patient's skin was the color of old ivory. Core temp reading 28.4 degrees Celsius. No pulse. No respiration. The paramedics rattled off their report in the clipped efficiency of people who'd pulled a corpse from water black as motor oil, found floating near the PA, witnessed, called 911, compressions ongoing for 12 minutes, 2 rounds of epi, nothing. The attending looked at the monitor, flat line stretching across the screen like a period at the end of a sentence, and shook his head. "Call it. Time of death." Ashley's voice cut across his. "No. Not a question. Not a request." She was already cutting away the wet clothes, her hands moving with the fluid certainty of someone who'd done this before, in places where there was no attending to contradict her, no protocol to hide behind. She called for warned saline, for the ECMO cart, for a 12-lead EKG that would show no electrical activity at all. The trauma team froze for a half-second, just long enough for them to understand they weren't following her orders, they were witnessing something, and then they moved. The attending stepped back. Something in her posture made arguing feel like a mistake. 72 hours. That was the rule for hypothermia. Dead wasn't dead until the body was warm and dead. Ashley had read the literature, understood the physiology, but more than that, she'd held this specific truth like a secret in places where it meant survival. She placed the warmed saline, started the slow rewarming protocol, and positioned the ECMO cannulas with the precision of someone threading needle and fire into human geography. The monitor showed nothing. Then something. Then a rhythm that looked almost like hope. The patient's name was Danny Rourke. No identification on him, so his file said John Doe until someone claimed him. But the personal effects told a different story, carefully folded in a sealed evidence bag waiting for him to wake up. Ashley glimpsed them when she was repositioning his for a faded unit patch, desert-worn khaki with an emblem she recognized with the intensity of a punch to the sternum. SEAL Team 3. Sangin rotation date from the patch, 2017. The year she was carrying children through smoke and praying they wouldn't ask why the sky was falling. She didn't touch the patch. She didn't let her hands linger. She documented his vitals and moved on, because Caldwell was already here, already asking questions about the patient's prior medical history, already circling like he'd found something worth owning. The isolation campaign began that same morning with the casual precision of a surgeon's cut. By noon, the schedule had shifted. Sharon Chen, the senior trauma nurse who'd worked alongside Ashley for 2 years without flinching, was suddenly transferred to pediatrics, something about staffing needs and her pediatric certification that should have been mentioned 6 months ago. Miguel Rodriguez, the one who always covered her break times without complaint, got reassigned to day shift pending operational restructuring. Jennifer Kim, the charge nurse who'd vouched for Ashley during the supply closet incident, was on administrative leave, performance review pending, the paperwork process so fast it felt like it had been waiting in a drawer. Ashley noticed. Of course she noticed. She was the kind of person who noticed the weight distribution shift in a room full of people, the pressure change before a storm, the difference between someone breathing and someone pretending to breathe. But there wasn't much to do with noticing. There was only work. Her badge didn't open the secure medication room anymore. The error message was clinical, access denied. Contact supervisor. Every single controlled substance now required a supervisor to witness, verify, retrieve. Every antibiotic came with a delay. Every painkiller became a negotiation. Ashley went through the motions, smiled at the supervisors, all of them Caldwell's golf partners or golf partners' proxies, and watched the seconds tick away while patients waited for medication that should have taken 90 seconds to retrieve. The real knife came on day 2. She overheard Caldwell on his office phone, the door cracked just wide enough for his voice to leak through. "Yes, I'm concerned about her mental stability. Possible PTSD, erratic behavior, marked social withdrawal. I think a fitness for duty evaluation is warranted. Contact the state licensing board. Tell them I have documentation." Documentation. Ashley's hands were steady when she heard it, but her jaw clenched hard enough to ache. He was building a file. Building it carefully, with the kind of precision that meant he understood his enemy, understood that you couldn't just fire someone like her, that you had to bury them under paperwork and psychiatric evaluations until they quit, until their license was suspended, until they disappeared. Danny Rourke's vital signs improved on day 2. Heart rhythm stabilized. Pupils responded to light. The monitor showed something that looked almost like consciousness trying to push through heavy fog. Ashley was in the trauma bay at 2,200 hours doing post-shift charting when she found the transfer orders. Caldwell signature. Digital timestamp. 0400 hours the next morning, Danny Rourke scheduled for transfer to undisclosed facility per JSOC request. Emergency transfer. Classified destination. No civilian facility name, no receiving contact, nothing but the official seal and Caldwell's authorization. Ashley pulled the medication orders. That's when her hand shook for the first time. The sedation protocol was wrong. Propofol at 12 mg per kilogram per hour, high enough to suppress respiratory drive in someone with Danny's injury profile. The order's time to peak during the 0400 transfer window. The medication would take effect at 0300. The transfer window was 0400 to 0430. The math was simple. Danny would be sedated too deeply to object, to fight, to call for help. He would be loaded into a vehicle, government issue, unmarked, and moved somewhere that no one would find him. She photographed the orders with her phone. Her hands finally trembled. The nursing supervisor was Gerald Patterson, one of Caldwell's regular foursome at the country club. Ashley approached him in the hallway with the photographs and her concern and her careful clinical language about sedation levels and respiratory compromise. Patterson listened without expression. "You're overstepping your scope of practice, Cooper. Patient transfer protocols are physician-directed, not nursing decisions. The dosing is elevated. The physician deemed it appropriate. The patient can't consent to. Are you questioning Dr. Caldwell's clinical judgment?" The question hung in the fluorescent-lit silence like a threat that didn't need to be finished. Ashley attempted to document her objections in the patient's chart. The system locked her out. Access denied. She tried 3 times. Same message. Her credentials were flagged at the hospital level, not just the medication room, but the entire patient documentation system. She couldn't read charts. Couldn't access records. Couldn't even log into the nurse's station without a supervisor entering her credentials on her behalf. Caldwell found her at 2,345 hours standing in the empty hallway outside Trauma Bay 3, staring at the closed doors like she could see through them. "You're done interfering with my patients, Cooper." His voice was calm. Which was worse than anger. Anger was honest. This was the sound of a man who'd already won and was just explaining the terms of surrender. "Security will escort you out if you enter that trauma bay again. You're on administrative suspension effective immediately pending the outcome of a fitness for duty evaluation. You'll receive official notice by courier tomorrow morning." He walked past her without waiting for a response. Ashley stood in the hallway, hands flat against her scrubs, jaw tight, and felt the careful architecture of her civilian life collapse like a building with cut supports. By 2,300 hours she was in her decade-old Honda in the parking garage, the engine dead because the battery gave out 3 weeks ago and the replacement cost $680 that she didn't have. The dashboard was dark. The radio was silent. Her phone was alive and screaming with missed messages. 17 missed calls. 12 from unknown numbers. 3 from the hospital. 2 from colleagues whose names she recognized from the staff directory. All of them distancing themselves. All of them choosing sides. The group chat that she'd been part of for 2 years had removed her without explanation. She could see the conversation in the notification history. "She's compromised." Caldwell said not to trust her. "Just keep your distance." Her head was against the steering wheel. The parking garage smelled like motor oil and stale concrete and the particular loneliness of a place where people only came to leave. She knew what Caldwell was doing. The pharmaceutical discrepancies she'd noticed, they weren't administrative errors. They were a diversion operation. Opioids moving through Oak Creek Memorial supply chain in carefully calculated increments, distributed through channels that looked like wastage and spoilage until you understood the pattern. Organized crime. High-level distribution. Caldwell wasn't just skimming, he was facilitating. He was the funnel that turned hospital inventory into street inventory, and he was making money that meant he had protection, had connections, had the kind of power that could make a special forces major disappear from a hospital parking lot and no one would ask questions. And Danny Rourke had seen something. Knew something. Or was someone that Caldwell needed neutralized before she could piece it together. If she walked away, if she went home and waited for the official suspension paperwork and the fitness for duty evaluation and the slow erosion of her license, Danny would be in that transfer vehicle at 0400 hours, sedated to the point of respiratory depression, headed to somewhere that classified locations don't have return addresses. She'd fought her way out of Sangin carrying a child through smoke. She'd learned to walk again at Walter Reed through pain that made screaming feel like giving up. She'd built this small, quiet life in Norfolk because she believed that healing was enough, that service didn't require a uniform, that she could be Major Ashley Cooper and also be Ashley the night nurse, that those two things could coexist in the same person. But Caldwell had shown her that they couldn't. One corrupt doctor with golf partners and a state licensing board contact could dismantle everything she'd built in 3 weeks. Her hands were on the steering wheel. The parking garage was empty except for the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sound of rain beginning to fall on the asphalt above her. The clock was running. Danny would be sedated in 90 minutes. The clock was running. Danny would be sedated in 90 minutes. Ashley sat in her Honda in the parking garage, hands gripping the steering wheel so hard the plastic creaked, and made a decision that would end everything. She pulled the maintenance worker badge from her scrub pocket, borrowed during the chaos of a code 2 hours earlier, and climbed out of the car. The hospital loading dock was 60 feet behind her. The badge would get her past the security gate. After that, she'd have maybe 4 minutes before someone noticed. Her boots moved across the asphalt like they belonged there. Like she had a right to be anywhere in this building. The badge dangled from her neck as she descended the loading dock stairs, past the delivery trucks and the rain-slicked concrete, toward the side entrance marked staff only. The door hissed open. Fluorescent lights hummed their familiar electric song. She was inside. The ER hallway at 2:48 a.m. should have been quiet. Should have been manageable. Instead, it was chaos the moment she reached the main entrance corridor, nurses running past her toward the back exits, patients scrambling from waiting room chairs, security guards frozen behind the front desk like deer caught in a spotlight. The towering figure had crashed through the entrance exactly 30 seconds before she rounded the corner, his presence filling the space the way a fighter jet fills an airfield. 6'4". 280 pounds. Ski mask covering everything but the eyes. An AR-15 platform rifle held at middle ready. He swept the weapon across the waiting room in a slow, terrifying arc that sent an elderly woman tumbling behind a row of plastic chairs, sent a mother pulling her child down to the floor, sent everyone who had any sense running. Ashley kept walking forward. "You don't want to do this," she called out, her voice cutting through the screams with the clarity of someone who had stood in worse places. Her hands were visible and empty. Her pace deliberate. She was closing the distance while the part of her brain that had been forged in a decade of combat situations was calculating everything, the gunman's stance, weight distributed heavily on his right leg suggesting a left leg injury or weakness, the way his eyes kept flicking sideways toward Trauma Bay 3 down the corridor, the slight tremor in his left hand that meant fear not training. That meant someone had handed him a weapon and a target and told him to walk into a hospital and commit murder. "Step back," the gunman said, his voice muffled by the mask. "I'm not fucking around here." "I know you're not," Ashley replied, closing another 10 feet. "But you've never done this before, have you? Your breathing's wrong. Your hand is shaking. Whoever sent you didn't tell you there'd be this many witnesses. Didn't tell you how hard it would be." She could see his finger moving toward the trigger. Could see the decision forming behind his eyes like a raindrop forming on a window pane. She positioned herself between him and Trauma Bay 3, her body becoming a barrier, and spoke with the calm of someone who had already survived the worst the world had to offer. "Put it down. Just put it down and walk away. You can still walk away from this." The ER went dead silent. Not the absence of sound, the presence of restraint. The moment stretched like taffy, like rubber, like time itself was holding its breath. The gunman's weapon wavered. His finger eased off the trigger. For 3 seconds, she counted them, 3 solid seconds that felt like a year. He stood there. Then he backed toward the entrance, weapon still raised, his eyes still on hers. He hit the automatic doors and ran into the Norfolk night. The radio at her hip crackled to life. Dr. Caldwell's voice, thin with rage, "Cooper, stand down immediately. Security, remove that woman from the floor. Now. She's assaulting our visitor." 3 officers converged on her from the back corridor. Ashley didn't resist as they forced her hands behind her back, didn't fight as they secured zip-tie restraints around her wrists. The cold plastic tightened against her skin with a sound like a snake drawing back to strike. She felt the weight of the unit patch inside her jacket lining, the faded insignia sewn there years ago as a reminder of who she actually was, pressing against her ribs like a second heartbeat. Dr. Caldwell emerged from his office with his hair perfect and concern etched across his features like makeup. His power was on full display now, the ability to control the narrative, to rewrite events in real time, to weaponize the system itself. "That woman just interfered with a police matter," he announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the ER. "She endangered every patient in this facility. Hospital security will be filing assault charges immediately. I'm terminating her employment for cause, effective now." They walked her out through the main entrance in handcuffs while her former colleagues watched from doorways with their eyes already looking away, while patients filmed on their phones, while the SEAL in Trauma Bay 3, Danny Rourke, 4 years old in Sangin, now 31 and carrying wounds from a different war, was wheeled toward an ambulance with paramedics in uniforms she didn't recognize. The sedan that had delivered the gunman was already gone, disappeared into the rain like it had never existed. She was in the back of a hospital security cruiser, watching the building shrink in the rear window, knowing that Caldwell had won this round. Knowing that Danny was gone. Knowing that her civilian life was over. 2 hours later she was sitting in her Honda with the engine dead because she couldn't afford the battery replacement and the rain hammered the windshield like applause for something that had gone wrong. Her phone filled with texts from former colleagues, each one a knife, "Can't support you anymore, sorry. What the hell were you thinking? We barely knew you anyway." The isolation was complete. The severance was total. She pressed her forehead against the steering wheel and let her hand shake for the first time since she'd walked toward an armed man with nothing but composure and math and the memory of a 4-year-old boy's voice singing along to lullabies while the village burned. Then her phone rang. Unknown number. "Major Cooper." The voice was female, measured, federal. "This is FBI Special Agent Teresa Martinez. We need to talk about Dr. Caldwell, and I think you're going to want to hear what we found. Can we meet you in your vehicle in 5 minutes?" The parking garage lights flickered once. Twice. Then steady again. "Yeah," Ashley said, and something shifted in her chest, not hope exactly, but the return of possibility. "I'm not going anywhere." At 0315 hours, the hospital's routine background check flagged something that stopped a clerk's fingers mid-keystroke. Ashley Cooper. Security clearance level, top secret SCI. 3 federal agencies received simultaneous notifications. Then one JSOC liaison made a phone call that woke an admiral who hadn't slept through the night in 17 years, and the admiral's first words weren't polite. By 0647 hours, Dr. Marcus Caldwell sat in the WTKR News 3 studio under hot lights, tie knotted tight, explaining to concerned Norfolk residents how he'd neutralized a dangerous, unstable employee with a history of violence. His hands moved as he spoke, practiced, authoritative, the gestures of a man accustomed to being believed. "The safety of my staff and patients," he was saying, "requires difficult decisions." The anchor nodded sympathetically. Then the studio phone rang. The anchor's expression shifted. She pressed a button. Speaker mode crackled to life. "This is SEAL Team Commander Banks, Naval Station Norfolk." The voice came through like a tank idling in a garage, low, controlled, absolutely certain of its authority. "I need you to listen to what I'm about to tell you because you just slandered a decorated officer on live television, and that stops right now." Caldwell's face went the color of antiseptic. The woman you arrested is Major Ashley Cooper, United States Army Special Forces. Silver Star. Purple Heart. She evacuated 17 people from Sangin Valley in 2009, including one of my operators who's currently in your hospital recovering from injuries you helped inflict. A pause. Long enough to feel like judgment. So let's talk about dangerous, Doctor. The studio went so quiet you could hear the fluorescent hum from the ceiling panels. Then the monitor beside the anchor flickered to life. A video feed. A man in dress uniform, the shoulders bearing the trident insignia of naval special warfare, his face older than it should be at 31, and his voice, when he spoke, cracked like a teenage boy's. Major Cooper. He stopped. Swallowed. I'm Danny Rourke. I was 4 years old when you carried me 6 miles through Helmand Province with my mother in your arms. I've spent the last 22 years knowing my life meant something because you decided it did. In her decade-old Honda in the parking garage, Ashley watched the broadcast on her phone screen, her hand steady as surgical steel, her breathing controlled. An FBI agent had slid into her passenger seat at 0631 hours with a personnel file thick enough to stop a bullet. Photos of Caldwell meeting with men whose tattoos meant cartel affiliation. Wire transfers. Pharmacy logs with altered timestamps. Numbers that told a story of systematic theft, of life-destroying quantities of oxycodone diverted into the Volkov organization's supply chain. Of murder ordered like a lunch order. Commander Banks' voice continued from the phone speaker, each word a nail into a coffin. Major Cooper spent 2 years at Walter Reed learning to walk again. Learning to breathe without a ventilator. Learning to live after a 40mm grenade fragmentation wound that would have killed most people. His voice hardened into something that sounded like winter. And you put her in handcuffs for protecting my operator from the hitman you hired. The FBI has been tracking your operation for 6 months. Cooper just gave them everything they needed to bury you. On screen, Caldwell's lawyer appeared at his side, too late, moving like a man trying to stop a tsunami with a briefcase. But Caldwell wasn't looking at the lawyer. He was looking at something past the camera, at the weight of consequence finally made visible. By 1000 hours, Caldwell was in custody. By 1400, his medical license was suspended. The Florida cartel connection unraveled like a cheap sweater the moment the FBI surveillance recordings went to prosecutors, Caldwell's voice cold and clinical as he discussed eliminating the Cooper problem and making sure the SEAL doesn't survive transfer. 3 other hospital staff members were arrested before lunch. The pharmacy tech who altered logs. The nursing supervisor who locked Ashley out of patient records. The head of security who coordinated the gunman's access to Trauma Bay 3 at 2:47 a.m. The local news cycle became frenzy. Footage of Ashley in handcuffs, image stabilized and looping, juxtaposed against her Silver Star citation. Interviews with patients whose lives her hands had saved. Sharon gave a tearful statement to WTKR describing how Major Cooper had talked down a suicidal veteran in the parking lot using techniques Sharon now understood were battlefield crisis intervention. She was never just a nurse, Sharon said, and the camera caught the exact moment the truth settled into her expression like recognition. By day 3, Caldwell's wife filed for divorce. His country club revoked his membership. His home was vandalized with paint and rage and the justified anger of a community that had trusted the wrong man. He became the face of institutional corruption, of medical ethics perverted into profit. The hospital faced liability suits from 4 separate class actions. The administrator who'd backed him resigned. And Marcus Caldwell, released on bond pending trial, became something worse than imprisoned. He became invisible, a man who couldn't show his face in the city he'd controlled because that city had seen exactly what he was. 6 months later, the sun came up over Norfolk at 0600 hours on a Tuesday, and Ashley Cooper walked through the main entrance of Oak Creek Memorial as its newly appointed Director of Emergency Services. Her limp was barely noticeable, the kind of almost imperceptible shift in her gait that you only noticed if you understood what muscle memory costs. She wore her jacket, the one with the faded Special Forces unit patch sewn inside the lining where it had lived through 2 years of Walter Reed and 2 years of hiding. Her credentials hung from her neck. A small silver star pin caught the light at her collar. The ER staff stood when she entered the morning briefing. Sharon led the applause. Danny Rourke stood in dress uniform at the rear, the trident on his shoulder catching fluorescent white, and when he presented her with a plaque from SEAL Team 3, for the major who carried us home, his voice was steady now, the crack in it years healed. As she walked her first rounds, reviewing the new pharmaceutical tracking systems, the revised protocols, the veteran liaison program she designed during the investigation, Ashley paused at the lobby windows. Movement below. A figure in a security guard uniform emptying trash receptacles at 03 for 7 hours. Marcus Caldwell. Stripped of his medical license, stripped of his position, working overnight security at the hospital he'd run as both punishment and restitution mandated by federal court. His face had hollowed. His movements were mechanical. When he glanced up and saw her watching, he froze. His eyes looked away first. Ashley turned and walked toward her new office without acknowledgement, carrying her go bag, the unit patch still stitched inside where it belonged. Behind her, Caldwell returned to emptying trash in an ER where nurses no longer learned his name because it wasn't worth remembering. That evening, standing in her office, she removed the jacket. The faded patch, color softened by 18 years, by Sangin dust and blood and the weight of lives carried, was framed now, hung beside her medical license and her military commendations. The phone buzzed. Text from Commander Banks, drinks at the O Club when you're ready for that joint special operations medical consultancy position. She typed maybe and meant it. Meant the deliberation. Meant that the choice to stay, to heal, to lead rather than command, was exactly what Major Ashley Cooper had learned to do, move toward the people who needed her instead of away. The camera pulls back through the office window, revealing the ER below where nurses move with purpose and patients receive care, where the night shift is beginning and a woman in a new uniform reviews charts with the quiet authority of someone who's already survived the worst. Heroes walk among us. Sometimes in scrub saving lives in the dark. If this story resonated with you, if you know someone like Major Cooper, someone whose real strength has been invisible until the moment it had to be seen, subscribe, like, and tell us in the comments, what would you have done? Would you have walked toward that threat, or away from it?